The boy with dog mask cooks food. This episode, I'm going to be making a kvaefjordkake, which is a cake that originates from Norwegia, and it translates to world's best cake. And I start off by mixing in some sugar and some melted butter in a stand mixer. The recipe comes from North Wild Kitchen, and the link can be found in the description. Now, I'm dropping in one egg yolk at a time for it to be incorporated to the mixture, and it helps to even it out and give it a nice creamy texture. And as it gets thickened, I drop in some cold milk, and it helps to thin it out a little bit. I let it mix and let it blend well. And at some point, I will be adding the rest of the ingredients, which is flour, sugar, and baking powder. Now, the recipe did call for vanilla sugar, which I do not have any, but I do have an extra half of a vanilla pod. And so I'm going to be using it here with a little bit more sugar instead. Generally, baking recipes are like chemistry experiments, and you do want to stick to the recipe, but this is a very minor adjustment, so I think I should be able to get away with this. Now, as the mixture evens out, I'm going to pour in the flour and the rest of the dry ingredients. Now, you probably might want to have stir is with a spatula or something to even it out so you don't get this powder bombs going everywhere. Now, I brought out a baking pan that is oiled and a parchment paper is put on top of it. This helps it makes it easier later when the cake is done to be pulled off the baking pan. And you grease the pan before putting the parchment paper because you want the parchment paper to stick to the pan. So when you're working, parchment paper isn't just rolling up and moving around because it does make it kind of hard to spread this batter. And this batter is rather thick. So now I'm pushing it into a ball and I'm spreading it onto the uh, baking pan. Now, the batter is not actually enough to cover the baking pan, so don't be surprised or and don't make an attempt to spread it across the baking pan because your batter or your cake mixture is going to be way too thin and it will burn. And I actually made that mistake and I spread it out a little bit too thin and I did burn the bottom of the cake slightly. Now, you want to spread it out, make it nice and even so it cooks evenly. And you want to make it as much as it into a rectangle as you can. It does help reduce the amount of waste. And when you do trim it into a nice rectangle cake, it does look a little better. But the extra trimming, don't throw it away. I got something you could do for it at the end of this recipe. So, a little bonus here. So now I spread it out. It's a very thick batter, and I'm just going to set it aside for the time being. The second part of this recipe calls for a meringue, and that's the next big component of this cake. And it's actually one of the things that makes this cake kind of unique and very enjoyable because it is sweet, but not super sweet. But it's the texture of the cake. It has all sorts of textures going on, which makes it very enjoyable to eat. And meringue generally is very simple. It's two recipes: egg whites. Sorry, you do not want any egg yolk in your egg whites, but it's mainly egg whites and sugar, and then you just throw in the stand mixer and let it go. And what you're actually doing is incorporating air bubbles and it creates structure, which creates the, I guess I would call it a foam. cream, and that's actually what makes meringue. Now, you can theoretically overbeat your meringue, but I find that's pretty difficult to do, and you can tell when your meringue's done because when it's done, you lift it up, you can see nice stiff peaks. So I've been checking it a couple times, and it gives a very nice silky white texture when it is ready. So I'm still going at it. I'm checking a couple times. It's still a little liquidy, and it could still go a little further. So I'm letting it mix a little bit more. People do add tartar to help create the structure. This recipe didn't call for it, so I didn't use it. But you can pretty easily do it without it. And in the past, when I used it, I didn't really notice a whole lot of difference. Maybe it did speed up the process a little, but as you can see, it's nice and thick now, and it creates a very good structure. Now I pour and spread it over the batter. And the interesting about meringue when it's raw is it acts almost like an insulation. And that's kind of what Bake Alaskan, which has basically cake, ice cream in the middle, and sealed with meringue. And the ice cream does not melt when it's being baked because the meringue acts as insulation. Now I spread it evenly across the batter. Some people will try to put peaks on it to get a little more decorative design. But in this recipe, I'm folding it together, so it's not important for me to have the texture. Generous sprinkling of almond slices. You can toast it, but I figure it's a little bit redundant since the whole thing is being baked. Now, this is the third portion of this recipe or the component of this cake, which is the custard, which goes right in the middle of it. It gives it a nice, creamy, silky moistness to the cake. Now, I'm going to be scalding this milk. So I'm putting it into a pan or pot, and it's going to go on the stove on low heat. And you do need to stir it to make sure it doesn't burn. Now I'm using the rest of that vanilla pod that I used earlier, and this is the other half of it. Cut it open, scrape out the seeds on the inside, which is the flavor, and I'm adding it to my milk because it helps to, I guess, infuse the flavor of the vanilla. And I figure a little bit more infusing, a little bit more soaking probably will help add that flavor into the milk. So it goes to the stove and it gets warmed or scalded. And now I'm basically going to incorporate the rest of the ingredients for the custard together, which is cornstarch, egg yolks. So the good thing about this recipe is you actually don't waste any eggs. And you do want to temper it so you don't actually cook your eggs. And you pour a little bit of the scalded milk and the egg yolks together, and you keep blending it until it makes a nice silky texture. So I switched over to a bigger uh, mixer or whisk, and now I'm going to start tempering it. I add a little bit at a time. I mix it, and this will give it uh, much more liquidy in form. So that way, when I incorporate it to the rest of the milk, it blends in a lot easier. And then once this is all nice and silky, I might as well add a little more to thin it out a little more. And now back into the milk. And this all goes back onto the stove to be slowly cooked and for it to be thickened. And once it's thickened, it's nice and gooey, and you're gonna let it rest and cool down. And once it's cool, now I'm gonna assemble the cake. And I take it off the pan And the next thing I'm going to do is cut it in half. So now I get one nice clean edge of this cake. And I'm going to get a nice clean pan that this is all going to sit on. And this thing does need time to incorporate in itself, and it's going to sit in the refrigerator ideally at least for like a couple hours, but the best is to do it overnight. Now, remember earlier I mentioned to you that I did burn the cake slightly because my batter was a little thin. And I think realistically, you probably can cook the cake a little shorter than what the recipe calls for. Now, I spread the rest of the cooled custard onto the cake. The bottom half of the cake I flipped upside down. And now, once you get all the custard on there, spread nice and evenly, you're going to go and add the top half of the cake, and you're going to refrigerate it and let it soak overnight. The custard still has some moisture, so it will soak back into the cake batter itself. And also kind of solidifies and adds like a nice piece of glue. Right now, it's still a little bit jiggly and slides, but once you set it overnight, it becomes like glue and the whole thing becomes one piece. So this is now one solid piece of cake. I flip it over and get it out. Now I'm going to trim it to make it into a nice rectangular cake. So I'm just going to cut off the other edges and try to make it into a nice rectangle. It is nice and cold, so it is also actually pretty firm. So all those extra trimming that you see, I mentioned earlier, I'm going to give you a different recipe for the things that you could do with it. And that way you basically make two separate desserts out of this. Now I have a nice rectangular cake. And it probably would have been nicer if I had spread the custard a little bit more evenly. But there you go. That's a cake. Now, all those extra trimming, I'm going to basically make a trifle, which traditionally uses cake, meringue cookies, and fruits. I have pretty much all those ingredients in those trimming. And all I need to do is just add some fruits to it. And basically, I have whipped cream, vanilla, and sugar. So that's heavy whip. And once I throw into the stand mixer to be battered for a while, it will turn into whipped cream, freshly made whipped cream. This is a simple version where I'm just adding a little bit of vanilla and some sugar for taste. Now you could just let it whip until it makes a nice. And I also added a little bit of salt. Salt, for some reason, helps a lot. So I just added a pinch of it, and I'm trying to scrape off the rest of that whipped cream. Now I'm taking all these leftover chunks of the cake, and I'm going to just basically store it on the pan right now, and I'm going to clean my cooking area because next step I'm going to start make preparing the fruits. The recipes and for both trifle and the Norwegian cake both garnishes with strawberry. So I'm cutting up quite a bit of strawberry. And honestly, I think you probably can use other fruits, but strawberry seems to be the preferred item to go with it. Now I'm making little thin slices. I'm mixing it into that pan with the cake chunks. So I'm making these slices. And once this is all done and the whipped cream is made, you just combine together. It's very simple. You use up everything from what you cooked and baked, and that way you don't have too much waste. So there's the whipped cream. nice and fluffy, not the canned stuff. I mean, nothing against ready whip, but the fresh stuff is much nicer. So I'm just incorporating it. And if you want, you can make extra whipped cream to go on the cake itself. And you can serve it with a dollop of whipped cream and some strawberry slices garnishing it, which does make a nice, prettier presentation. So just incorporate it. It creates a nice cake texture. The custard, which is a nice addition, which you don't find in the original trifle recipe, but this one has it. So it adds a little bit of moisture. I'm going to be scooping it into ramekin, and I'm also going to do the same thing. I'm going to throw it into the refrigerator and let it sit overnight to allow all the ingredients and flavors to incorporate with each other. It does ruin some of the crispier texture, but these almond will be enough to cover for it. And all the leftover gave me approximately four small ramekins worth. So it's great. I have a whole cake. I have a second type of dessert. Nothing is wasted here. And I did make this cake for someone's birthday. So I saved the trifle for myself. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.